Okay, hello. It is 1 o'clock and we're going to get rolling. Welcome to the first of 6 ESF webinar series. If you have not had a chance yet to view the video, no worries. I think if you'll stay with me, this will still make sense. But if you have not, I would encourage you after this to go ahead and go view it because I think it'll help it make even more sense. So we will reference the 6-pager and exemplar packet. You do not have to have those in front of you, but if you do, feel free. If you don't and want them after this, if you'll go to the email or the SMORE and print them, I think they'll be a useful tool for you. So let's jump right in. Just a brief refresher on ESF. Really, our intent in doing this is sharing what we feel that TEA has come up with. It could be a super useful tool to any campus, whether you're an A campus, an F, or anything in between. So our goal is really to try to unpack these. There's 13 what we call essential actions. They're the blue boxes listed under each one of these levers. We are going to do a deep dive into 6 of those. They call these they're the high leverage essential actions or prioritized essential actions. So we're going to start with the end in mind, that really we're going to start at the core of what the ESF is all about and actually work our way backwards. So I hope that makes sense to you. The core that we're starting with, if you look under effective instruction, there's actually 2. It's the only one that has 2 essential actions and that are high priority. And we're going to start with the first one today, and next week we'll unpack the second one. All right, so when we look at effective instruction in the core, we're going to dig into the objective-driven daily lesson plans with assessments. In the 6-pager on page 5, remember we're starting with the end in mind and kind of going to work our way backwards in this series. If you printed it, turn to page 5. If you haven't, if you just look on the screen, it has exactly what's on the page for you, and we'll process through it together. So when you look at, or what is laid out for us, is they've identified the key practice under effective instruction, and we call this 5.1. So there'll be 5.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, because there's 4 essential actions under effective instruction. So we often refer to this as 5.1. So when we look at the key practice, it's kind of what is the goal of this lever. So if I'm digging into 5.1, the key practice defines for us the goal, which I don't know about you, but as a campus principal, we know the things to work on, and we're aware that culture is important, instruction is important, alignment's important, but really some of us may or may not have been on exemplar campuses, so we really might not know what the exemplar looks like. And so this is what is so fascinating about this system, in our opinion, is it really kind of defines an exemplar and the things that we would be looking for. And it not only defines those, is it really prioritizes. Now it says, of these 4 essential actions, these are the 2 to start with. When you have these well-grounded, then you go on to the next. Or it's not necessarily in continuum, but they're the most essential to have. So we're going to look at this key practice. I like this top section, in my opinion, really refers to what teachers are responsible for. And that bottom section and this one refers to what instructional leaders are in charge of on the campus. Now, with that notion, if we look at that top one, there's a few things in here that instructional leaders are the driver for. For example, when we look at the top key practice, all teachers create and submit daily lesson plans that include, and it goes on to include what the list of this exemplar lesson plan would include, which I don't know about you, is something I've always struggled with. It's what are the best things to include in a lesson plan. But when you go over to the right, it details it. So as we look at the success criteria, it really talks about what is the evidence? So based on what your practices are, what is the evidence? If you look at what your current practice is, and I put this criteria, kind of like a set of glasses you put on it. So if this is my lens and I'm going to look at our practices, do we include all of these things or some of these things or none of these things? So our evidence says, kind of like the survey says, well, the evidence says that yes, we are completing this, we're accomplishing this or not. So I'll tell you what got me so excited is once I started understanding this tool, that I really started seeing as a campus principal, I could easily go through and kind of self-identify. If I look at that top box that we complete, our lesson plans, do they include an objective? opening, closing activities, pacing, instructional activities, formative assessments with an exemplar. Maybe your lesson plans include one of that, but if I'm trying to decide on next step, here's the answer. It's kind of a recipe. What are the missing ingredients? But with that, stopping to celebrate any ingredients we have in there at the moment. So when we dig into this, we're looking at what is the goal of this lever, and then putting on the success criteria, thinking about our practices and what do we have evidence of accomplishing these. And then if there's any missing evidence, that would help give us some direction on possible next steps to take. So to simplify this one, what I don't want us to lose sight of as we do this is that the start of this, the title of it right here is Objective-Driven Daily Lesson Plans. So is it objective-driven? That's number one. And then with formative assessments, number two, period. And that's really the simplest form of this that we could get to. Now when we're digging into objective-driven, well, as you read through the success criteria, that really layers on what could that look like. And based on research, what are best practices to layer on? So if you don't have any of these practices, what a gift this is to give you direction on layering. If you do have these practices, great. And maybe you have more than this and you need to simplify. This would help you decide where to cut the fluff, so to speak. So as we dig into the success criteria, I'm going to go down, not to read it all to you, but kind of just do a little bit of a dive into each component. And then what we're going to follow up with is look at some exemplars. So when we go to the second bullet, under success criteria, is it aligned to the scope and sequence? Is it daily objective to the standard? And is it measurable to the student learning output? So essentially, do I have a daily learning objective? And then will I assess what kids know for that day? Every day. So this is daily lesson planning and what that looks like. Then as we keep going, is it informed by student data? Does it include frequent checks? Is it detailed? Is it enough detail that anybody could walk in the room and pick this plan up and use it effectively? And is it aligned when executed? So I have seen this happen. Teachers can plan so well, but then when you get into execution, that they do not follow the plan. So once executed, is it in alignment with what the plan is? So now as we think about as campus leaders, we go into the next box. This is always what's neat when you're going into practices. I always think, well, what am I asking my people to do? But then what can I do? What's my investment in this process too, to support it? So this is what's really neat. These are the high leverage based on research things that we as campus leaders can do to support the work of lesson planning. So we look at that bottom box. Do we review lesson plans frequently for alignment to the standards? So I don't know about you, but if you've ever looked and think, what am I looking for? You're looking at alignment to the standards. Are they aligned to the scope and sequence at the expected level of rigor of that standard? Of course, we cannot all be experts in every content, but absolutely as campus principals, we can know how to access the scope and sequence and how to identify if the standards planned are in line with the scope and sequence. And then once we look and review it, does it align with the rigor as well, and provide feedback around that. Even if we do not fully understand or are not masters of the content, we can give feedback and support around that. So when I go off over to the right and the 3 check boxes of the success criteria, thinking of evidence, say, okay, I can do that. Then I think, well, do I do that? So then I think, do I evaluate lesson plan objectives and activities alignment to standard, scope, and sequence? Then I go on, is it precise and bite size? Is it 1 to 5 precise pieces of feedback per daily lesson plan focused on teacher actions? So really focused on what teachers can control and have the greatest positive impact on student learning. But the last but not least, is it timely? So is it really delivered in time that can impact that teacher's planning? So would it be when are their lesson plans due? When do you provide feedback? And is it in a cycle that's frequent enough that really can impact their instruction? In other words, do they have time to do anything with your feedback before delivering instruction? So one of my favorite things about the way TEA has rolled out the ESF framework is they provided some exemplars. And with that, there is not a one-size-fits-all. In this, every campus is unique, your needs are unique, but what they have provided is based on the success criteria that we just went through, is what is an example of what would provide all of these things. So this is a sample lesson plan, and as you can see, it has the objective. So anytime that we are deciding, and you probably have a current practice that you're already underway in the school year. So what I would challenge you to do is pull up that success criteria just like we would with this one and think through the components. Does it include an objective? As you can see in our exemplar at the top, it does. Does it have opening and closing activities? For my campus, we called this lesson framing. So we called it a we will, I can. So what would we learn? Put in student-friendly language based on the standard, and how as a teacher will I know that kids know it? So as you can see here in the lesson agenda that they have with timestamps, they have a due first and then an exit ticket. So it meets that criteria. Then we look at the next one. After opening closing activities comes pacing. Well, pacing is included in this because their expectation is under a lesson agenda that they would timestamp their activities, which then in turn would impact pacing. Instructional activities with differentiation. So if I look down there, I think this could be included in the conceptual understanding, or probably most likely the possible student misunderstandings to watch out for. So as I'm tailor making this to my students, whether it's an ELL learner, if I'm needing to add any accommodations into it, or possibly even enrichment extent, I could plan in this component. So I would say this planning template meets that, and then formative assessment with an exemplar response. So if I go down to the bottom, aligned assessment items, definitely see that we're pulling assessment. I think I would have to know more and look at specific lesson plans to see, but the expectation here is that that is aligned to assessments, but then how will it be assessed? We'd have to see what they planned here. But if you go up to the middle, criteria for success, right under objective, this really is where they would have to identify the exemplar of what is the goal that they want students to learn for that day. And so this would be pre-planned. And so this is an example, really an exemplar. You could lay this against what you currently have in practice and see, and it's just an idea. So if you don't have anything in practice, what I love is this gives you something to look at and an idea to start with. So in that second box, in 5.1, remember we talked about the leader's action. So here's a sample lesson plan feedback that was provided through the ESF work. So this is feedback from an instructional leader to a teacher regarding their lesson plan. And what we always want to do then is pull up the success criteria and add that lens to this evidence. So you may have feedback that you've provided to teachers, and so you could pull yours up and think, based on the success criteria, how is my feedback? I don't know about you, but I often wondered what kind or type of feedback to give. So really, does it meet that precise and bite size? Is it based on the objective? Does it evaluate the lesson objective and activities alignment to the standard? And so these are the high leverage feedback choices to choose. And is it timely? Is it delivered to the teacher with enough time to implement the recommended changes? So I'll be honest with you, most of my feedback to teachers, I have never grown yet to include this link. However, I love the opportunity to get to read another leader's feedback, and it's definitely something that I could work and grow towards as a leader. But as you can see, they added different components. Mine generally was just focused where we were on objective, and if it was in the standards, if we were in the scope and sequence, and then of course, any just precise bite-sized things that we were working on per teacher. I didn't state this. If you have any questions as we go, you please feel free to include that in the chat. So I am jungle tigering. This is new territory for me. This was my campus the last few years. And so I wanted to share this with you because one of the things that one of the reasons I wanted to bring this to you in a Zoom is, as a campus, that we knew our data was trending in a way that we did not want it to go. And we knew that we wanted to work on some things, but you can only do so much at once and trying to figure out what those high leverage things were to start with. And the next best steps for us is what was challenging. And what I think is so valuable about this resource is it truly can be a guide to your next steps. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of our journey. And the reason I'm going to do that is because it just depends on where you are in this, would depend on where you would start. And with that too, I wanted to show you that we didn't tackle the work all at once. That it was really, we did it one step at a time and phased in as we could. With that, I didn't have that checklist or the success criteria like you do now. But like I said, as principals, we know those things are important and trying to hone in and figure out what those are. And so we started year one with really identifying the standard and framing the lesson. Current practice, of course, teachers were planning. They had never submitted lesson plans. So our year one, we really kind of added that. They had to submit those electronically. And the intent of lesson objectives truly is that the student knows and understands the learning objective. Therefore, we were required to have them posted on the board and share with kids. And then anytime that we were implementing initiatives or changes, I always think, what am I asking my teachers to do? And then how can I support the work in that? So my commitment in that was that I checked, tracked, and encouraged weekly. I really created a spreadsheet, and it was more for my system to know if I checked or not. And I grew in capacity and feedback at that. Honestly, where I started was just, did I check weekly? Were they submitting weekly? And really focused on identifying standards, and did their lesson frames or learning objective align with the standard they had chosen? So it just depends on where you are, would depend on where you would start. Your campus may be well down the road from this and possibly alignment, or maybe you're implementing new resources and they're trying to align those resources to their standards, but they have been standards planning. So it just depends on where you are, depends on how this might be helpful to you. Year one, we also, in this work, speaking to this work, really worked on aligning our PLCs. In other words, the conversations happening in PLCs. We really focused those on our campus targets, including standards alignment. I say that we implemented this because I had a leadership team. We implemented a leadership team this year, and this leadership team was imperative to choosing which of these things we would focus on, and therefore implementing and supporting the work as well. And then the way we chose to do it was a Google form is how they submitted their PLC, and teachers loved it because it essentially gave them minutes, and because once they submitted, it emails them a copy of what they typed. But then what I loved about it, it allowed me an opportunity to be at every PLC without physically being at every PLC. So we aligned that work around it. And then year two, that really we added on that second layer of aligned unit assessments. Of course, in year one, were we assessing students? Absolutely. But we just weren't calibrating yet in year one. So we really started calibrating in year two. So our assessments were teacher created and admin reviewed prior to unit planning. That was a new practice and something that we had to really grow into. And then teachers administered and responded, and we developed systems around that, which actually will lead into next week, and we'll get into data-driven instruction and some different ideas, share some exemplars around that. So to put kind of some, what did this look like for us? Well, really, as we go to back to the top of our year one, is our teachers started attending planning sessions, and those were at the service center where the specialists were leading them through unpacking their standards unit by unit. And so this is an example of one of them. This wasn't a campus system we did, but rather it was led through the service center. I know our service center is also going to be having these planning sessions. I think I heard yesterday, they said there's over 20 sessions in 3 different locations that will be shared. And so I bet if that's a need for you, that you could find one. This was a kind of just a clip of the spreadsheet. So essentially I said this was just for my system. So this was, this is by week. Every column is a week. And then I just put an X if I checked it. I put an N if I wrote them a note about it, gave them any feedback, or an E if I emailed them. And then if you see a blank, it means I didn't check those that week or they were in a team. And so the goal was every week. As you can see, I am not perfect, and every week did not happen because as we all know, life happens sometimes. But when I started tracking it, I did find that my consistency was much better than it was before. Here's a PLC form. It's just a Google form. What I really wanted to show you is if you did something like this on the admin side, it actually prints a spreadsheet. So essentially, I could read the notes from every one of their PLCs to see what students were growing, what students were decreasing. And then we always had a spot for needs admin attention. So anything that teacher group needed, they would put here, and then as I responded to it, I would highlight it and put a strike through text so I knew that I had responded to that need. So that's where it references that was my commitment to follow up weekly. So moving forward, if I were still here or still there this year, and now that I know what I know based on the ESF, I'm telling you, for this campus and for what I know today, my next steps, if I'm looking at this, I do not have evidence. So when I look at that success criteria, I do not have evidence of pacing that the lesson plans nor requirements would show me, because there is no time-stamped activities included in that. Also, there is no evidence of an exemplar response. So these are two things that I would take to my leadership team and we would look at. I'm really proposing to include those, or what would that look like? Something that I do not have evidence of yet would be that, does it include enough detail that another teacher could pick it up and plan and use it effectively? And I kind of dashed around it because basically right now, the way I'm understanding is that might not be the most important thing to focus on, that possibly pacing and exemplar response are. But in the same event, I'd want to make my leadership team aware of that as we're making decisions moving forward. And then last but not least, really, my commitment would be to deliver teacher feedback with enough time to make recommended changes. Our lesson plans were not due until Monday morning, which essentially only if I'm providing feedback on end of the week lessons could that happen. So the decision as the leadership team then would have been to require those lesson plans earlier, giving leaders opportunity to provide feedback to where teachers could implement that. So if I were there this year, knowing this rubric, so that's kind of how this works. For the other components of this, I can pretty well check off that yes, a lot of those components are there, but not completely. So just give some guidance into what next steps could be, and that's how I would layer this and use this for the campus that I was at. So as we're finishing up, really trying to hold to the 20-minute, we're at 22 minutes. If you have questions, if you will include those in the chat, absolutely feel free to email me. My office phone number you may call to, and my cell phone number are included on the screen. And be sure to save the date and mark your calendars for next Thursday. We will dive into 5.3, which is data-driven instruction. Really go through the same process. We'll share some exemplars with you and dig into those. I thank you so much for joining me. Hope it's been helpful, and we'll see you next Thursday.